one or more colleagues today, please let us know how many other people are sitting in with you today. So good afternoon, I'm Bonnie Weddle. I'm the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives and co-chair of COSA's State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which focuses on the record-keeping implications of blockchain technology. This webinar is part of SERI's Spring 2019 webinar series, and future months will focus on extraction of gubernatorial records and accompanying metadata from an internet quorum system, and one state's development of policies and protocols for managing, preserving, and providing access to electronic gubernatorial records. We won't have any webinars in July or August, but the fall 2019 slate of webinars will begin in September. As the schedule firms up, we'll spread the word via COSA's website, listservs, and monthly news briefs, so stay tuned. I would also like to call your attention to a new online educational resource that the SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee has developed. Based on the Library of Congress's digital preservation outreach and education curriculum and expanded to reflect the specific needs and concerns of state archives, Managing Digital Content Over Time is a series of videos that discuss the core activities associated with digital preservation. Identification of the digital content you have or will have, selection of content that warrants preservation, storing content appropriately, protecting content from inadvertent or deliberate loss or alteration, management of over time, and provision of access. These videos are a modular, self-paced, and always available resource for employees who are new to your organization or to the topic of digital preservation. At the moment, you'll find them on the website of the Utah State Archives, which graciously did the technical work needed to produce them and is hosting them on behalf of COSA at the link you'll see on your screen. When the recording of and slides associated with this webinar are posted on the COSA site, you'll also be able to find the link in those files as well. In addition, we will be moving these recordings over to COSA's YouTube channel. When that happens, we'll share the YouTube links via COSA's website and social media accounts. And on to the matter at hand. We're really fortunate to have today's presenter, Nick Connizzo, with us today. Nick is currently Digital Archivist and Digital Records and Information Management Specialist at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, where he works on both records management issues with public agencies and on long-term digital preservation for public records across the state. Nick is the co-chair of SERI's Tools and Resources Subcommittee and spends most of his time trying to figure out the ways to track down all of the crazy and complicated ways that governments collect, use, and provide data. I'm going to transfer control of the slide deck over to Nick. And while I'm doing so, please note that we will hold all questions until the very end. However, please feel free to enter any questions that come to mind in the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen at any point during today's presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to the Council of State Archivists for giving me the chance to talk to you all today. And thank you to every member of the audience who came out, and I look forward to hearing what questions you have. I don't think that what we'll be talking about today is necessarily a completely solved topic, and I hope that as part of this, this presentation can be part of the ongoing dialogue, in and around state, federal, local government about how to deal with technologies like blockchains, ones that can be transformative or disruptive, and how we can kind of keep abreast of these developments and how we can not fall too far behind, because ultimately our job is to both manage and preserve these types of records regardless of what systems or technologies our records creators are using. And if anybody can't hear me, just let me know. I think we did some testing before, but it looks good so far. So, let's see if this. A couple things that I hope this webinar is going to be today. I hope that it will be informative to you. I tried to keep it high level. This is not going to be incredibly technical or really in-depth, but there will be some technical issues raised. And more importantly, I hope this is thought-provoking. Like I said, there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I don't plan to provide all the answers, but hopefully this can kind of move us down the path and give you a foundation that you might be able to answer these questions someday. A lot of us might be dealing with blockchains or blockchain-enabled technology somewhere touching our state government or local government, or it might just be something that we're trying to stay aware of because we know it might be coming someday. So it's not going to be necessarily a solution to all your questions, all your problems, or an answer to all your questions, but I think it will be informative. So, here's what we're going to cover today. I'd like to provide some learning objectives. Also, I always call this the, you can tune out now if this doesn't apply to you. But ultimately, we're going to talk a little bit about public records. We assume that you have a general knowledge of what the foundations, how public records are a little bit different from maybe other records that other institutions are collecting. We came up with a really simple and high-level framework for evaluating technology, and we used it kind of in this method. We used this method to evaluate blockchains, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what blockchains are, why they are, what they're created for, and really how do they work. Then we're going to apply the framework that we previously talked about to blockchain technology at, writ large. And then lastly, where do we go from here? How do we preserve? How do we present? And how do we deal with these records moving into the future, especially if they're archival records? So to give you a little bit of background, I want to talk about the state of Vermont and how we got involved in blockchains. So the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, which is where I work, it was created in 2008. It was a combination between the Division of Public Records, so that's the records management side of state government, and the state archives, which is obviously the archives part of state government. So now that they are combined, we are on kind of both sides of the house, I like to say. So we deal with helping state agencies manage their active records, but also, for records that are scheduled to be permanently retained, we deal with the long-term preservation of those records as well, and of course everything in between. So I am both a records and information management specialist, so I deal with the record management side of things, specifically electronic records, but then also a digital archivist, where I work on the digital archives and the long-term preservation program. So in 2015, we were asked, the Secretary of State's office, which is where VSARA is located, we were asked by the legislature to do a report on blockchain technology. And this was this long kind of culmination of this long legislative process that started with, a bunch of proposed laws that not a lot of people in the legislature really understood about blockchains and bitcoins and things like that. So, Vermont is not necessarily a place where the legislature acts rashly. There's a lot of study that's done, sometimes to good effect, sometimes to really just delay certain things. In this case, basically the legislature wanted more information about blockchains and blockchain technology generally. So they asked the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, and the Commissioner of the Department of Financial Regulation, essentially those are our banking regulators, to work together in order to come up with a small paper that was about blockchain technology. That's published on VSARA's websites, and you can find it on the state legislature site as well. That was our 2016 report, which is essentially what is blockchain, what are the opportunities for government, and what are the potential risks for government using this. So that's where we started. That was obviously extremely satisfactory to the legislature because 2 years later they asked us to go back and do it again, this time with a much more specific charge, which is to say, 3 bullet points here, but the first 2 are really the most important one, and number 1 is really what we'll be talking about today, which is how they asked the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration to evaluate blockchain technology for the systematic and efficient management of public records. So the result of that work was a white paper that we published, Blockchains for Public Record Keeping and for Recording Land Records, a 5-star entry in the Department of Redundancy Department in terms of titling, but either way, this was the culminating effort of our research into this topic. Essentially, what are blockchains good for? What are they not good for? And are they appropriate for the management of public records? And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. So hopefully we can start with what are public records? We're not going to go too deeply on this, but what makes a public record different from another type of record? So hold on a second, did I accidentally zoom in here? There we go. So I just pulled off a couple of definitions, one for Vermont and one that comes from the feds. I'm not going to go through these specifically, but in Vermont and in terms of government, we generally have pretty broad definitions for what public records are. In Vermont, it's any written or recorded information regardless of physical form or characteristics that is acquired or produced in the course of agency business. What does that really mean in layman's terms? It just means any data that's written down, any information that's written down, or anything that is captured in an electronic medium. So it's a lot of stuff. It's every email, it's every VoIP phone call that we receive. It's our instant messages and our text messages, and all the other normal stuff you would come across in in government, so databases, documents, etc. So I think we all know what public records are, but we try to say what is different about public records from other records, ones that are held in private custody or manuscript collections. And a lot of it has to do with the body of law that add requirements to how these records must be treated. And that law might be contained in actual laws that are passed, or executive orders, or session law, or judicial orders, and Supreme Court opinions, and other decisions, and administrative orders, and all types of different sources of law could govern access to, management of, retention of, and protection of information that is within public records. So when we were asked to do an evaluation of blockchain technology, naturally we go to, well, what are all the requirements we have for public records? And there are some very broad fundamental ones, but then there are many, many very specific requirements, even just in Vermont, for how we must treat and what our responsibilities are related to public records. But in addition to that, there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of legal and business processes that use public records on a daily basis, both internal and external to state government, that are, well, frankly, they're really important to people's lives. So whether you're talking about vital records, needing to prove your identity, that probably, everyone on this call has probably needed to show their birth certificate in a number of different places, whether it's to get a driver's license or a passport or open a bank account or whatever it is. Then there are licenses and permits, which are essentially this authorization to perform a service or do a construction project or whatever. Land ownership and other instruments that record who actually has possession or legal right of ownership over, like I said, a piece of land or a car or a boat or a motorcycle or something. And then lastly, all different types of certifications that the government does in terms of, whether you are able to operate as a business, whether you are able to, operate as an attorney or a doctor or something like that. And this is just a small selection of the processes that public records are used for. There are potentially thousands and thousands more. One of the things we like to say is that what is government really in the business of? It's collecting information and then disseminating information. A huge amount of the work that we government employees do on a day-to-day basis is gathering information about stuff, remixing it and reviewing it, lots of times analyzing it, and then turning it into something else, whether that is a license, a permit, a deed. I mean, if you look at all these records, essentially they are the culmination of the collection and some business process that is done on some information. So suffice to say, public records are important. I think we all know that. So how do we actually take all of these myriad requirements for public records and actually put it into a useful framework for evaluating technological systems? So this is something we've been thinking about a lot. And there's not an easy way to do so. So, in state government and in government generally, I would be surprised if no state or, around the U.S. didn't have some sort of contracting or procurement policy. So there are those type of requirements. What do you have to do to solicit bids and, request for proposal and request for information and, working with vendors and so on and so forth. So that can get really complicated, and we could do an entire presentation just on that. Couple that with the hundreds or thousands of specific statutory, administrative rule, and other legal requirements for records, and you start to have this project that you can't really compare a single technology against all of those requirements and whether they're meeting them all. That would be way, way too big of a task, and frankly, the attention span of what this report is for, that's really not what it's intended to do. So what we decided to do was to default back to a broad standard, and we went to ISO 15489, which is the International Records Management Standard. It's pretty broad, and it actually gives us what we thought was a pretty clean framework for actually evaluating this and potentially other technologies as well. If you haven't looked through this one, I can strongly recommend it. It was recently updated in 2016, so it's pretty fresh. And really, we're talking about 4 different elements that are identified as being important. And again, this is a broad framework. It doesn't say how they're important. It doesn't say how to evaluate them, but these are the elements that are important for management of records generally. Those are authenticity, reliability, integrity, and lastly, accessibility or usability, which I'm going to talk about all 4 of those. I think that this was valuable, and if you were to read the white paper, this is what a lot of our work is built off of, and you'll be able to see when we actually get to our evaluation of blockchains why each of these things matters. Of course, these are not the only things that matter when it comes to records management. There are things like how much resources does this actually take, how much cost, how much staff time, so on and so forth. So there are other factors that go on here. So, I don't want to be reductive in our evaluation of any particular technology, and there are lots of practical concerns on a day-to-day basis for the actual people who are going to be working with these records. So we can't ignore that, and we will discuss that a little bit later, but really this is what we're focusing on primarily. So what are these 4 elements? If you have some experience with records management or really just records at all, which I presumably most people on the call do, a lot of this is going to sound very familiar to you. So what is authenticity? Well, record authenticity basically is, what are the elements needed to prove that records are really what they say they are. And the 3 elements that are contained in the ISO standard are, the record is what it claims that it is somehow. The record is, its authorship can be proven to be authentic as well, and its place in time, so when it was created or received or sent, that can also be proven. So there's really this temporal authorship and this identity factor which all must be satisfied. This concept, you may have heard it called as provenance, right, or chain of custody, or there's lots of ways to kind of be talking about authenticity. Can be very, very important for public records. We'll kind of get to why it's more important, why there's a very high standard for public records, but public records are used, again, in many, many legal processes, so being able to prove that your records are authentic can be very important. So we care about that a lot. Next is reliability. This is one of probably, I always think that this is the trickiest element to kind of pick apart, but, can the record be trusted to, I always say, is a record a source of truth, right? Can we actually say that the record is, the information contained within is true? So I'll give you a good example of how a record can be authentic but not reliable. So, there's all types of records that we know are created that are using bad business process, right? Data entry, manual data entry in which someone is typing information from a form into a database. We can prove pretty well that those records are authentic if we prove that it was done on a state computer and the database is on a database server that's state controlled, and there's a good audit trail for when that information was entered and who changed it and when they changed it and so on and so forth. That all helps us prove the authenticity. What it doesn't do is prove that the person actually keying in the information did it correctly. So a record can still have reliability issues if we can't actually trust that the business process that created it or the process that preserved it and managed it is itself not reliable. So this is a really high standard potentially. I think that reliability in general often gets taken for granted. We tend to assume, I think just by human nature, that when we're looking at a record in an archives or a record that's produced by a government, that it's fact, right? It's been given to us by the archive, therefore it's true. But of course we know that's not true. There's context that is really important around the creation of the record, and really that is a lot what reliability is getting at, the context for the record. Then there's integrity. Integrity is actually on the opposite, pretty simple. Generally a record can be said to have integrity if the record itself is complete, again, no loss of context there, and unaltered. That's where we're going to start getting into trouble. There's a lot of debate we could have. We could probably have a long presentation on unaltered originals, but in general, if all the significant properties of the record remain, then we can be generally pretty sure that it is unaltered. These are really important because, again, you can't really trust a record if it's not complete, if it's lacking that valuable context, and you can't really trust a record if you only have half of it, because, it may contradict what it says in the beginning and the end, or that necessary context may provide some clues as to what the actual meaning is. And then lastly, we have accessibility, which is something that I think that most of us are probably spending most of our time on a day-to-day basis trying to actually figure out the best way to do. Can records be found when they're being looked for? Can they be retrieved, which again, finding a record and actually being able to retrieve the record, not necessarily the same thing, but usually they're pretty close. And then lastly is, this is the tough one, which is being able to present the record and the information within in an intelligible manner. Whether that's human readable, machine readable, it really depends on the circumstances, but ultimately, accessibility is about, is there actually any value to a record if it can't be read? That's a good question. Sometimes, we have thought that accessibility is kind of this opposite to, it's not opposite, but it kind of stands opposed in some ways to the other three elements, your authenticity, your reliability, and your integrity, because, it's easiest to preserve some of those things by putting our data in a dark vault and never letting anybody see it. And, I always say it's relatively easy, air quotes around easy, to do bit-for-bit preservation, but what's hard to do is file format migration, right? Being able to carry records forward through time in a way that makes them still intelligible. So if we can't do that, what do we actually have? How much value do our records have? Well, I think everybody will know that there are records at many of our institutions that can't be read. They can't really be used, and they're reduced to, we just call them coasters. You might be familiar with them. You might have them laying around your office right now. As technology moves forward, I don't have to tell anyone on this webinar that things like obsolete media become more and more difficult to deal with, and even when we can read them, that doesn't mean we can actually recover the data and make it usable or preserve its accessibility. So that's a really quick summary of what the four elements are. How important are they? And I'm biased, of course, having worked in much of my career for public institutions, but essentially, the standards for public records are pretty high. I said medium to high for authenticity. Of course, we want authentic records, but typically there are other techniques that we can use to demonstrate that records are authentic without actually necessarily needing to rely on the technology itself to provide that for us. So something like chain of custody, we tend to be able to say it has been in the custody of a state official for, its entire life cycle. Regardless of what technology was used, it's likely that it's authentic, right? It wasn't tampered with. Reliability, yeah, we have a really high standard for reliability. You all could probably come up with even better examples than I could for how records produced by government are used as the basis of fact. And we've seen, the bad examples of when the reliability of those records is called into question, or the information within is collected or otherwise recorded in a questionable way. That's when some of the real problems we have in our society is when things go off the rails. And of course, we all know how important having actual integrity of our records is. That's why we do most of the digital preservation techniques and processes that we have, is to ensure that we don't lose anything. Of course, in an electronic record, even the loss of a single bit can really change the integrity of the document. Of the record, and so that's really important to us as well. And lastly, just if for no other reason that there are freedom of information and other sunshine laws that allow the public, usually on a pretty quick turnaround, really broad access to public records, the accessibility has to be as high as well. And truly, records do provide, and open access to records do provide, this window into the actions of state government. And one of the things it says in the Vermont statutes, and really in the Vermont Constitution as well, is that the public has the right to audit and essentially monitor the actions of its of its governmental officials. And if there isn't accessibility on the records, they can't do that. So really not fulfilling our constitutional obligations. So then we start to run into trouble. So I don't think it's going to come as a a huge surprise that I think that public records are important, and therefore any system that stores, manages, preserves, and provides access to them also must be robust. We really, I think government in general does not have as high standards as it should for its records management systems, and it has been a big campaign of SERI, both in Vermont and a lot of our professional organizations nationwide, to increase the robustness of those systems, because we can see all too well what happens when those systems break down. And then, again, if for no other reason that there are legal requirements, we literally will be breaking the law or violating, our citizens' constitutional rights if we don't do this. I always say it makes it easy for us because we have no choice. We have to do it. But on the other hand, kind of making those arguments and articulating them in the right way is really the key to doing all of this. So where does blockchain come into all of this? What are blockchains? How do they work, and why do they matter? So, without really going too deep, I want to start with Bitcoin. 2008, I linked it in here, so when you actually get the slide deck, COSA will post those on its website, so you can kind of click on all these links. There's going to be a couple interspersed throughout this presentation, but the Bitcoin white paper, it's short. It's probably like 12 or 13 pages. It's pretty accessible. It's not overly technical, and it really lays out the purpose for making, and this is really the inception of individual blockchain technology. Of course, since 2008, there's been this incredible proliferation of public and private blockchains out there. There were thousands of them in 2015 when we first started doing our work, and there's undoubtedly more and more now. Just in some preparation I was doing for this presentation, I was just seeing how easy it was to create my own blockchain, and there are guides for that as well. So you can go home as soon as you're done with this and create your own blockchain if you want. But suffice to say, this is where it all got started. And the question is, why was it started? There had been thoughts about doing electronic currencies for decades before that, really since really the internet kind of took off in the 90s. But how did the Bitcoin and Satoshi Nakamoto, how did they actually solve this problem of, I want to send this money or I want to transact some business over the internet, but I don't know anyone that I'm doing it with, and I don't trust anyone that I'm doing it with, because part of the purpose of blockchains was originally to remove the need for there to be a trusted third party. If you were to read the paper, you'd understand that essentially the original goal is to say, I don't want to have a bank as a broker, or I don't want to actually have to use, let's say, the government as a broker for to secure my identity. You want to be able to say, I have $5, I want to send it to you, and there doesn't need to be any middleman in between there, making sure that I am who I say I am, and making sure that you are who you say you are, and that everything is copacetic. So how would we actually do this? Well, again, blockchain is the solution. So, I pulled out a couple definitions here. What we said in our report was, and this is a definition that I wrote, again, it's not perfect. There's a lot of different ways that you can move these sliders around, but essentially it's this electronic register of digital records, events, or transactions. They're represented in this condensed form that are, this is the hash, something we'll talk about in a second, but many of you are probably already familiar with this. There's a broadcast over a network, they're authenticated, and they're maintained through this peer-to-peer network of participants. So the idea in general is that there is no central authority. There is no, third party or middleman institution that is maintaining this network. It truly is a peer-to-peer electronic currency system, or for the generalized blockchain, and just a peer-to-peer, quote unquote, again, I'm making air quotes here, record-keeping system. So, as you can imagine, it's pretty tough to talk about and to analyze a technology, as we were asked to do by the legislature, without there's no, we could have started with Bitcoin as kind of our exemplar, but there are hundreds of blockchains that have multiple millions of dollars of market capitalization. There are thousands of individual blockchains, as I mentioned, and all of them have all different types of technology that's supporting them, whether it's different hashing algorithms, different consensus protocols, different peer-to-peer networking setups. All of them are slightly different, and again, to evaluate all of them is not really possible. So what we tried to do was to boil it down to a couple of key elements. And those ones I've kind of thrown up on the screen here, which are public key cryptography, peer-to-peer networking, validation and verifications of transactions, and a register of transactions in a network, and those are what your blocks are. So to give you a really quick summary of what all these things are, there's one thing you could do, read both of our papers. That'll give you an more in-depth summary. But quickly, public key cryptography is just a technique that has been around, I think, again, I'm not remembering exactly, but since the early 80s or late 70s. It's not revolutionary technology. Essentially, if you do anything on the internet, you're interacting with this technology all the time. So for example, when you go to Amazon.com and you want to send them your money so that they'll send you, a package, how do you know when you type in www.amazon.com they're actually going there? Well, Amazon has signed with their public key their websites. So that's what's called they have their own digital certificate that says, it's encrypted their sites so that using they did it with their private key and published it with their public key. This public-private key pair allows them to send information over the internet and for you to receive it without you being able to spoof them, right? So without others being able to pretend to be Amazon. This is basically again, this is my opinion, but this is probably the most important technology we have that actually makes the internet possible. Otherwise, everyone would just have their information stolen from them and their money stolen pretty much all the time. So this is super important. It's important in blockchains as well because every transaction that is going out to the chain is going to be encrypted in some way. The second part of this is the peer-to-peer network. Again, I mentioned this already. There is kind of no centralized authority. So you're really just talking about hundreds or thousands of different individual CPUs out there that are working together to create this register of transactions. Each of those individual member CPUs, which is called a node, what they are doing constantly is receiving incoming transactions, whatever those transactions might be. Again, we keep it pretty broad and just verifying that they are correct. That person A sent money to person B. That person A did X and person B agreed to it. When those transactions are verified, they're added to this growing ledger, and that's a block. A bunch of transactions together is a block, and that's really essentially it. It's not really super complicated, even though there's a bunch of different math and cryptographic algorithms and protocols underneath that are making this happen. But really, it's a pretty straightforward process. And this is generally how it happens. Something is transacted between party A and party B, whatever it is. And let's just take the Bitcoin example and say that I want to send Bonnie $5. We agree on this transaction. It gets broadcast to the network. Not only what the transaction is, but also a timestamp. That's a very important part of this. There's a timestamp server that essentially allows us to say this happened at X time. Why that's important is because when you're dealing with a digital currency, one of the big problems has always been how do you prevent a person from spending their money 15 times without the various different people knowing about it. A bank prevents this by having a ledger. You have a bank account. They won't let you spend your $100 10,000 times. They have a record of how much you have and how much you don't have. For blockchains, of course, there is no central authority, so the timestamp is really important. You're not going to be able to send your $100 10 seconds after you just sent it because it's already gone. It won't validate. And then there's metadata about each of these transactions. But in general, transaction data and indeed block data as well, very, very compact by necessity, and we'll talk about why in a minute. After that transaction is complete, it's broadcast at the network. The nodes in the network receive and validate these transactions using different types of protocol, whether they're called consensus protocol. Bitcoin operates on a proof of work. There are a bunch of different complicated ways that these transactions are verified. But usually what it is using that public-private key pair, as I described before, to basically say, yes, Nick decided to send this money, he signed it with his digital certificate, and I'm validating that it is true, and indeed it was him, he did send this money. Once a number of those together are validated, that completes a block, which could have a couple or thousands of different transactions inked in it. The important part of a block is that we'll actually look at the anatomy of a block next, which is there's a bunch of information contained within a block. Usually it is a set of all the different transactions, the timestamp of when that block was added to the chain, the location in the chain. Sometimes it's called the height of it. What's really important about the chain and really what makes it the blockchain is that every block is sequential and is linked necessarily to the block before it. So it's not possible to really fake either transactions in the past because there will be no link to it from other blocks, right? So if block A is linked to block B is linked to block C, you're not going to be able to create a fake block A because it won't be linked to anything. That's why we have both the hash of the current block and the hash of the previous block contained within the block itself. Then there's the Merkle root as well, which I'm going to get to. That's going to be really important for us who are dealing with long-term preservation. This allows us to be able to validate some of the data within the block without necessarily having to save the entire blockchain. So we'll talk to that. And then there's other metadata, potentially who has actually solved the block, depending on the protocol, other information about the height of the block, the size of the block, etc. But really, in general, blocks are pretty compact, and that's because most of the work that is being done is the encryption and decryption of data by these nodes. And when you're sending data to a network, and then you're encrypting or decrypting it, anyone who has run any type of digital preservation workflow can know that if you have a giant file, even running a hashing algorithm can take a really long time. And if you're having thousands of CPUs kind of encrypt and decrypt these documents, that's a lot of processing power. And so if you want to keep your costs down, you want the data that you broadcast to be small. So there's not a lot of extraneous. In fact, there really isn't any extraneous data that's being carried here. So that's going to be really important because there is very little context for the data in these blocks. Really all you're going to have is a link to the previous block and a little bit of metadata in it. So I know that that's a really, really fast overview. Believe me, I could do, and I'm sure that there are some others that are out there right now. University of California, Berkeley does a pretty good video series on the underlying technology of blockchains, which I can recommend. I can't really do it justice today, but my hope is that, the truth is we don't need to know every single aspect of how everything works, right? You don't need to know how a database works or how an operating system actually talks to hardware to be able to understand what is important about these records. And so my goal here is to actually talk to you and try to explain what's actually in these blocks and what data are we actually talking about. Oh yeah, can I guess I can just do a quick explanation. I know we're supposed to hold questions to the end, but yeah. So essentially, hashing it's a technique that we use in digital preservation as well. If you're familiar with something like a hashing algorithm called, you might have heard MD5 or SHA-1 or SHA-256. Essentially, these are mathematical or computer algorithms that they take a set of data, whether it's a record or a set of records or whatever, and they condense it into a small chunk of information. Usually it's 256 characters or 64 characters or 128. It's usually a power of 2. But essentially, running a document through a hashing algorithm produces essentially a fingerprint, a long string of characters that is unique. If you hash that document using the same algorithm again, it'll produce the same output. That's called the hash. How is this valuable? Well, one of the awesome things that you can do is I can have a document and run the hashing algorithm that produces really small chunk of information, 64 bits or 256 bits. I can then send that to you along with the document, and you can run that same algorithm on the document and compare what you got and what I got. And if that document has changed, even by a single bit, it'll produce a wildly different hash value. So how does this work in terms of blockchains, and how do we actually use this in digital preservation? So what we do at the Vermont State Archives, in our digital archives, every document that comes in is hashed, and we store the hash value as well. So we know down the road if a document has changed, either because there's been some malicious actor or even just a glitch, we will know if the document is different, because when we run the algorithm again on it, which we do periodically, it'll output a different hash value. This is extremely useful because you get to be able to essentially, let's put it this way, you can kind of create a digital fingerprint for a record that, again, if that record changes, you would know. And if somebody tries to fraudulently, pretend to be that record, it wouldn't work. It's essentially impossible to be able to take a hash and reverse engineer it back to the original document, because again, you're dealing with a 256 character string or a 64-bit string, and trying to turn that into, a 20 gigabyte video file, that's not going to happen. It's many to one rather than one to one. So it's not mathematically possible to take your hash and kind of derive what its source document was. So that's pretty awesome. We'll get to some of the problems with hashes. I kind of talk about them at the end. They're not perfect, but they're very useful, and they're a nice shorthand for us being able to say, this record is what it is. So I mentioned, I'll kind of jump back in, but I mentioned Merkle trees as well. We can thank Ralph Merkle, who's a computer scientist, who kind of came up with this concept in the late 70s. Essentially, blockchains are usually, pretty much all of them are built with this type of structure to them. So what I'm showing you is a Merkle tree, which essentially is the hash of every transaction is repeatedly concatenated and hashed up to the top, so that what you can do, you can verify individual transactions without having to have the whole blockchain. You can also verify individual transactions within a block without having to have the whole block. Why is that important? Because the way that we send data in peer-to-peer networks, and really through the internet generally, is in chunks. We're not sending, a 50 gigabyte file. Is not being uploaded all as one contiguous essentially package. It's being uploaded as a bunch of individual packets, which are sent and received and relayed by our web protocols. So this is all very valuable because it allows the nodes to kind of reconstruct the data while still knowing that it's true. So this is going to be really important for us when we start talking about digital preservation, because of Merkle trees, we actually are able to be able to preserve some of the data, like the important stuff, without all of the nonsense data that is extraneous and is not actually valuable to us. So, why does blockchains work generally? Well, public key cryptography helps ensure that people can transact businesses with each other without trusting each other. It allows you to transact business over the internet while being anonymous. Whether that is desirable or not is not up for me to comment, but it allows us to do that. In some degrees, any transaction over the web is semi-anonymous because there's not actually a person at the other end. It's a computer, and there might be a person sitting at a keyboard, or there might not be. It might be an entirely different person. So having this degree of trust or being insulated from bad actors is very valuable. Transaction and block data are small. I already mentioned this, but generally the size of transactions and the size of blocks are necessarily kept very small so that we don't have this massive amount of resources that are required to be able to process and actually do these protocols. Right now, the Bitcoin blockchain is approaching 200 gigabytes, which is pretty impressive for something that's been pretty much in nonstop functioning for about 10 years. So it's really hundreds of thousands or millions of transactions, but still only very little. Having blocks that have linked to previous blocks, very, very important. That's your context. That's kind of your call it your blockchain provenance to be able to prove, and this is what most people tout when they say that blockchain is super secure. You can't fake old stuff in the blockchain. It's basically impossible because, again, there would be no link to it. One important thing I do want to talk about is compensation. Most of the time when we talk about these nodes, we're talking about a bunch of computers that are just anonymous. They're out there. Why are they actually doing this work? It doesn't cost nothing to be able to verify these transactions and create blocks and broadcast and receive things. They're doing it because they're compensated. And whether that compensation comes in the form of digital currency like Ethereum or Bitcoin or whatever, usually that's what it is. But sometimes there are other models that are set up as well. So there are tokenized models where you get a token for contributing your processing power to the network, and then when you want somebody to verify something for you, you spend your token, essentially, and give it to them. It's not currency, as in it can't be exchanged for money, but it is a type of currency that is used within this system. And then, one of the other things to keep in mind is that there's no single point of failure for a blockchain in theory, because there's no central repository for it. It's just kind of this broad network of actors. So there's lots of copies, and I think it was last month's SERI webinar was by the LOX folks. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. It's the same type of principle. Again, not a new principle, and that's something that's really important about blockchains is that all of the constituent parts, nothing is really that new. Peer-to-peer networking has been around since certainly at least the 80s, and I think earlier. Public key cryptography, the same. The idea of distributed storage and cloud storage, that's not exactly new either. So these principles have been around. It's just a matter of putting them all together in a way that accomplishes the goal. So how do we actually evaluate blockchains? And I'll kind of get through this pretty quickly as we've talked about this, but before I even get into blockchains, I wanted to say that it will be very important to talk about what type of blockchain systems there are. There's a really good paper that I like to refer. Again, it's very short and accessible by Victoria Lemieux at the University of British Columbia. Essentially just saying, well, what do blockchain systems actually look like, and what do blockchain record-keeping systems look like? Really, there's three big models for them. One is this, which she calls a mirror type, which essentially is you've got records that are sitting in a repository. Those records are not in the blockchain, but what is in the blockchain is the hashes of those records. So the blockchain kind of has the mirror of your records. Now, this doesn't necessarily help if your document repository goes down, but essentially you have some of your information mirrored in the blockchain. That could be very useful. Then there's the actual record type, which is, this is what we're talking about if you've heard the term smart contract before, or autonomous corporation. These are things that really the entire record is in the blockchain. There's a set of protocols that execute and kind of create individual contracts or transfers. That's a bit more challenging to deal with because all the data is in the blockchain. But again, all the data is in the blockchain, so we know where it is. And then lastly is this kind of in between, this kind of hinterland between having stuff fully in the blockchain and having only part of it in the blockchain is you have what she calls a token type, which is essentially what is in the blockchain is a token, and your token might be, it stands in for a real world object. So imagine the DMV when like the registration for every car is in the blockchain, or the deed. The title for every car is in the blockchain, and that when I transfer in the blockchain the token from myself to Bonnie, well, now she has the token which stands in for my title to my car, so now it's her car. Those are the different ways, and so looking at these different models can help us understand what is actually happening in the blockchain. It's not just oodles and oodles of data out there that's hard to interpret and make intelligible. So going back to our model, blockchains score pretty well on measures of authenticity. If we remember what was important about them, they are, it is what it purports to be. It was created or sent by the person purported to have created or sent it, or have been created or sent at the time purported. Fortunately, if you remember the anatomy of a block, all that stuff is in there. The transaction, the timestamp, and the block itself has metadata about it all being verified. We know that it's been validated, otherwise it would never have been added to the blockchain. We know that it has to be valid. So blockchains are really good at establishing authenticity. We know that, again, it's really hard, or again, I never say impossible, but it's really, really difficult to actually fake a block. Therefore, we can be pretty sure that if a block validates, it's authentic. On the other hand, reliability doesn't really help that much. Most of the blockchains that we looked at, they don't care whether a transaction, especially with token types, we don't actually know if the data that's going into the blockchain is good or bad, right? We don't actually know that Nick is actually behind his keyboard sending stuff to Bonnie. We just know that somebody with Nick's public key is actually sending stuff. So when you're measuring reliability, you're really looking at multiple different levels. Is the fact that a transaction happened reliable? Yes, we're very sure it's reliable. Are all the parties to that transaction reliable? Not necessarily. And is what was transacted actually reliable? Again, not necessarily. This doesn't solve the garbage in equals garbage out problem, which not necessarily an indictment of blockchains in and of themselves. A lot of systems have this problem. Next, we have integrity. How does it actually do? Well, it does pretty well in terms of integrity. Blocks are necessarily structured. They're always very, very structured, and to this degree where the first 4 bytes of the blocks are X, and the next 16 bytes of the blocks are Y, and so on and so forth. So if any of those pieces is missing, we would know immediately, and it would cause things to quickly spiral out and not work. So if a piece of the block was missing, the hash of the block would not validate. So you'd know that it would have a problem. So in terms of integrity, we do pretty well. And if things get corrupted, due to the distributed nature, if individual, my version of the blockchain gets corrupted, that's fine because there's 1,999 other copies on other computers. So distributed storage actually makes our tolerance for fault high. That's why, again, lots of copies keep stuff safe. But also, pretty much anyone who's working in digital preservation knows that if you have just one copy, you have a single point of failure. There's a lot of risk there. If you have 2,000 copies, that's probably too many, but on the other hand, you're pretty sure that if half of them go down, you still have 1,000 copies, and that's nice. Lastly, accessibility. In general, most people don't know what blockchains are. Most people don't have any concept of how blockchains are structured, and there's no internal kind of structure to a block or even blockchain data. There's not like a file format for blockchains. It's just raw data. And if you had a bunch of blockchain data sitting on a computer and somebody who had no knowledge of blockchain were to find it, it's very, very unlikely they would know that that was actually blockchain data. So we might have serious issues down the road actually being able to maintain the accessibility and usability of this information because once again, when you have a system that nobody is really accountable for and nobody is really in charge of, once the people that are sharing that information go away, what is really left? So not necessarily, it's hard to say whether the accessibility is good or bad. I said it was questionable. So we hit 2 of our 4 main, 2 of our 4 elements, which is pretty good. But the truth is that blockchains don't exist in a vacuum. We're just looking at blockchains themselves. But at this point, blockchain doesn't stand by itself as a solution. Many companies that are actually offering blockchain solutions are offering a combination of, we put some data in the blockchain, but there's also a document server and an identity server and an authentication server and so on and so forth. And so you really have a bunch of different technologies that are merged together, of which the blockchain is just one part. So we don't want to say that just because blockchains have score questionably in a couple of our different key elements that they're not suitable for public records. But in general, we got to say that the important thing is that blockchains are being used. Whether or not they're perfect doesn't really matter for us. What matters is that they're being used. There are a couple of pilots in the state of Vermont alone, one with the Secretary of State's office and the Department of Financial Regulation, and a couple that are going on with individual municipalities. So this technology is being used, and therefore we are obligated to figure out how to actually capture and preserve and provide access to this data. So, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I really want to quickly run through some of the open questions, and if there are other questions that the audience has, I'd be happy to answer them. I don't really know what SERI's policy is of going over time, but I have a little extra time so we can continue the conversation, and my email was on the front of this this presentation, so you can feel free to email me questions. I'm happy to talk about this. Like I said, there's a lot of information here, and I've gone through it quickly, but this is by far not a completely answered question. So firstly, the questions are trust. Blockchains are ultimately about trust. They were created because we wanted to do stuff on the internet without actually trusting anybody. Is that really necessary for government? In general, government, we assume that we are trustworthy. Do we trust ourselves? I would say generally yes. I mean, I know what my processes are, but we also know that that's not true for everybody. There are a lot of people, especially in the U.S., that don't have trust in government. And when you get outside of the U.S., we're kind of spoiled here, is that certainly there are governments around the world that are not trustworthy, and in fact they're actively hostile towards their own records, their own record keeping, their own history. So there is a pretty significant use case for not putting records, especially important public records, in the hands of untrustworthy individuals. That doesn't necessarily mean that an anonymous network of peers necessarily is trustworthy, but that's an open question. Who do we trust? Do we trust ourselves? Do we trust the anonymous network? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Secondly is custody. What does it actually mean to have custody of a record? What does chain of custody actually mean? A lot of time we've used for a long time, our legal standard in this country has been to essentially we use the heuristic of chain of custody. This was collected at the scene of a crime and it stayed in the custody of the police and then was presented as trial, therefore it can't be tampered with. Does that actually apply for records as well? Does that actually apply for electronic records, especially records which aren't necessarily in our custody the whole time, especially if they're in cloud storage, right? If they're on Microsoft servers or Google servers or Amazon servers, are those still in our custody? I don't have the answers to all these questions, but it definitely is something to think about because even if blockchains are not going to be a transformative technology for archives and for records managers, the way that they make us think about the ownership of data should be transformative to us. It will force us to rethink how we think about all this stuff. Next is context. Something that has been a frequent question that I've been asked, which is, what is actually the record on the blockchain? Is it the transaction? Is it the block? Is it a block in the previous and subsequent blocks? Is it the entire blockchain? It's kind of like asking the question, what is a record in a database? How are we actually going to preserve and provide access to these? There's a lot of open questions about that, and fortunately we have some techniques. Thanks again to Ralph Merkle for kind of coming up with these to be able to say, well, we don't need everything, but we do need a lot of stuff, and we do certainly need the context of what the protocol of the blockchain is, when it changed, what algorithms were involved, and so forth. And then more importantly in terms of context is, can we trust others to preserve this context? Can we trust this anonymous network to do so? And if we can't, if we do have to say, well, there needs to be a central authority that we can trust, isn't that kind of just defeat the purpose of blockchains generally? Which is that's the real paradox of blockchain. Lastly, I just want to say, I think that in my career, one of the things I've found is that most of the questions about long-term preservation are not questions of technology or not questions of will. They're merely questions of resources. It's, again, air quotes, but it's fairly easy to do bit-for-bit preservation of a document or of a set of records. But what's hard to do is the long-term strategic planning. What's hard to do is resourcing these actual processes and getting the right staff and getting the right institutions and making a financial commitment to sustaining this data. is the entire blockchain, the entire Bitcoin blockchain out there in complete form somewhere? I would guess yes, but I don't know where. There are a number of database sites out there that give you data about blockchains and might have them, but there's no guarantee that those sites and those services will continue to exist. So how is this data going to be sustained? Are we eventually just going to be headed towards a single point of failure again, as this data goes into the National Archives, or this data goes into MIT or another large university who's willing to kind of take on this challenge? Again, and if we're doing that, are we actually defeating the purpose of the blockchain in general? And there's some other questions as well. Can blockchains be scaled? What happens when everybody's using blockchains? What happens when 8 or 9 billion people are using blockchains for financial transactions every day? Is that actually doable? And there's the question of forking. Forking is when there is a disagreement. There's a disagreement in how between the consensus in the network. So, one that might have been in the news recently is the forking between Ethereum Classic and other versions of Ethereum. Essentially, basically, the network decides, this block is good, this block is not, and they go off in their different directions. How do we as archival institutions actually deal with that and make a choice? Lastly, a lot of things about blockchains are touted in the news as being they're unbreakable. Well, they're not unbreakable, and in fact, they can be attacked when you have a network who makes decisions based on what 51% of the members involved think. Well, if you control all 51% of them, you essentially control the network, and therefore is the trust broken in the network? I think so, probably yes, but I don't know if everyone would agree with me. Additionally, cryptographic security, often touted as being unbreakable, right? We have a hash function that it can't be matched. Well, yeah, we can't reverse engineer documents from hashes, but we can make, and there's a good, if you were to click on this link, there's a really good demonstration of how you can make two documents have the same hash value, right? Because it's a many to one. That's a problem because you can pretend that a document is authentic by saying, oh yeah, it produces the same hash output that you have in your blockchain or you have in your repository, therefore it's an authentic. And if we're relying solely on this methodology to prove authenticity, then we could be in for a big surprise. So we did have some recommendations. First of which is we need broad engagement between the blockchain community and the archive and electronic records community. There are a couple of efforts out there right now. There's some research being done in the academic community, but we in government, whether it's state, federal, local, we need to work together on that. We need to be able to audit blockchains if we're going to actually use them for public business. And then lastly, if we're going to try to have our own blockchains, if we're going to try to have private blockchains, we need to choose a model for how we're going to do it and if that actually provides value to us. So I know I went over 2 minutes, but I'm done. Does anyone have any questions? I know that was a lot, and this is a deep topic, so I'm happy to stay and answer some questions, but I leave it to our moderators.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. We can take a few minutes for questions, so if anyone does have any questions, please type them into the chat box that appears on the right-hand side of your screen. We are recording this webinar, so I'll be reading each question aloud. And Nick, while we're waiting for questions to come in, would you just transfer control of the deck back to me?
Certainly.
All right. While we're waiting, I just want to encourage everyone to fill out the brief evaluation that will appear on your screen when you close out of this webinar. We really do read these evaluations, and we will draw upon them when developing future webinars and online educational videos. So please take a couple of moments to complete the evaluation. Are there any questions? Actually, I have one for you. Could you talk a little bit more about the, actually someone else, I'm going to defer. How are blockchains different from running checksums if they are both based on hashes?
They're not. So kind of the difference. So imagine if you're making a checksum of your documents, what do? You're essentially running the same. You're kind of doing the same thing, right? What you're doing is saying, I'm running this algorithm. I'm creating a checksum, and then I'm storing both of them. What a blockchain is essentially doing is you are using your public key essentially to sign a transaction. So you are doing the similar type of hashing, but then you're broadcasting that information along with your public key to a network. And what they're doing is making sure that you are who you say you are, i.e. that this hash validates to your public key. So you're relying on this network of nodes to be able to essentially validate that, yeah, this is a real transaction. So, in theory, related to like an archival context, imagine all 50 state archives, right, or state institutions that have archival records decided that they all wanted to have their own blockchain. This idea, I'm not the first person to have this idea. I've heard this idea a number of different times. The idea is what you would do is you'd have this blockchain which you would kind of broadcast your hashes to, and you'd sign your records with, like the Vermont State Archives would have a digital signature, and when we sent out, we were saying we're putting this record into the chain, we'd hash it and send it out. All the other 49 states would verify, yes, Vermont sent that, yes, this is a valid transaction, okay, boom, it goes into the chain. Now we all have a copy of this, the hash for this record. That doesn't mean we have the record, right? The record is not actually going to be stored in the blockchain. It's just the hash that's going in. So Vermont, in this case, might keep the record, but everybody would have a copy of the hash. So yeah, the truth is it's not actually all that different, which is why it's kind of funny that, when we started looking at this, we're like, we kind of do this all the time. We've been doing this for like decades. So how is this actually that different? Yeah, it's not, in short, but, I took 1,000 words to say that.
Okay. My question is, could you talk a little bit more about the pilot projects that Vermont is undertaking?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I know. So the Secretary of State and the Department of Financial Regulation recently entered into a joint agreement to try to use blockchain for registration of captive insurance companies. So essentially the idea is that you would find a blockchain solution, whether it's Ethereum or something built off the Bitcoin blockchain, to allow corporations to register themselves with the state of Vermont in a blockchain. Essentially how that would work is they'd have their essential paperwork and they'd be able to sign it and send it out to the blockchain, and once it was accepted by the blockchain, theoretically, it would become a valid record, so their registration would be complete. The state wouldn't actually have to take any action. So it's an interesting idea, but that's really in the nascent stages. A couple of the other ones are related to land records. You'll notice that there was the specific provision in Act 205 that was for studying how these could be used for land records. That's because there was a couple pilot projects in South Burlington and Burlington, which the idea would be to figure out how land records could be transacted in the blockchain. Right now, it's only gotten as far as people transfer money in the blockchain, and in exchange for that money outside of the blockchain, like a deed is transferred. So, for example, Bonnie, if I were to sell my house to you, you buy it from me using Bitcoin, but then outside of the blockchain, I sign the deed over to you, and we say in the land records that this was done, this was paid for by, Bonnie's 15 Bitcoins on this date, and here's the height of the blockchain transaction, here's the block that it's in, and so on and so forth. So right now, it's still very much not necessarily contextually linked. It's kind of linked in a very manual way, but what a couple of these localities are trying to do is figure out, well, can we actually put tokens for our parcels, for example, in the blockchain and transact them in that way? So there would be a token for my property, and I just transfer that to you, and we could rely on the blockchain record to be able to say, well, who owns this at any given time? It's not really that different from digital currency. Instead of it being a coin, it's a property instead.
Wow, great.
So they're interesting. There's a lot of interesting projects out there. The state of Delaware has been trying to do stuff with blockchain for a couple of years now. The state of Colorado recently created a blockchain. I think they call it like their Blockchain Innovation Council. I might be wrong on the name of that, but there's a number of states who have efforts that are trying to figure out, can blockchains work for state government? One of the things that I would say is that they're a technology, right? They're not. I think we've all heard that blockchains are the solution to pretty much every technological problem that humanity has at some point or another in the last 5 years. Oh, maybe blockchain can fix that. But for the same reason that I wouldn't use a steak knife to do surgery, I'm not going to use a blockchain for every possible application. Ultimately, it's just a tool, and part of our job, not only as records managers and archivists, but part of our job as government employees is to figure out what is the right use for this technology, and I think there is a right use for it. I'm not sure that it's worthwhile to use it for records management or use it for digital, quote-unquote, digital preservation, because blockchain doesn't really do those things, and the way that it does them is way, way more resources than we actually need. So, for example, I don't really feel the need to put my records, the hashes for our records in a blockchain, but that doesn't mean it's not useful. Somebody might want to authenticate public records themselves without relying on me. That's useful if they have a public blockchain that our hashes are in. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of different ways this could go, and I would encourage everyone to reach out to Fasar or reach out to me if you want to be involved in ways to think about this, because I guarantee that this is not the end of it for Vermont, and it's certainly not the end of it for us in the U.S. And blockchain is going to be with us for a while, whether it's successful or not. There's a huge amount of data. There's a huge amount of investment in it. So, we're really just scratching the surface for how it can be used. So it's exciting.
Okay, great. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming.
Okay. Finally, I'd just like to encourage everyone to keep abreast of what COSA is doing via the COSA website, COSA's Twitter feed, and COSA's Facebook page. We've got a lot of interesting things in the work, and we look forward to sharing with them. Thank you to everyone, and have a great afternoon.